3 weeks after we buried my grandmother Abigail in the Kentucky clay, my sister slid a piece of paper across our parents' dining table. Clarissa did not blink. She just tapped her manicured fingernail against the bottom right corner of the page. Gran wanted to fix things before the end, Clarissa said. She knew Wyatt and I needed the acreage more. I looked down at the paper. It was a codicil, a legal addendum to a $500,000 property trust. The trust held 50 acres of prime bluegrass soil my grandmother had spent her life defending. The original trust named me. This new sheet of paper named Clarissa. Abigail had advanced motor decline. Her hands shook holding a simple teacup. The signature on this page swept across the line with unbroken, fluid grace. It was a statistical impossibility. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where quiet observation tears down loud lies. Tell me your age in the comments and let me know if your family ever tried to rewrite your history. Let us get into the story. My father Thomas stood near the coffee pot. He poured a cup and kept his back to the room. My mother Helen sat next to Clarissa. Helen placed her hand over my sister's wrist. We just want to honor her final wishes, Sophronia, my mother said. You have your data job in the city. You do not need a farm. I am 30 years old. I work as an Operations Research Analyst. My job is to stare at thousands of data points and locate the structural anomaly. A false variable throws off the entire algorithm. Sitting at that oak table, I did not feel the sting of a sister stealing my inheritance. I felt the cold focus of finding a false variable. The ink pressure was uniform. The spacing mirrored a digital font. Someone had traced a 10-year-old signature and called it a dying woman's wish. Clarissa pushed the paper a fraction of an inch closer to me. The title company just needs you to sign the waiver acknowledging the change, she said. Wyatt, her husband, leaned against the doorframe wearing a watch he bought with money he owed my parents. It makes the transition cleaner, he added. They wanted clean. They wanted 50 acres of ancestral soil to liquidate to cover their bad debts. In Kentucky, land is not just an asset. It is a ledger of who stayed and who bled to keep the fences standing. Abigail left it to me because I was the only one who respected the dirt. Clarissa saw it as a bailout. I looked at my mother. She refused to meet my gaze. I looked at my father, still staring at the coffee maker. They were willing to let my sister commit a felony to keep the peace in their living room. I did not raise my voice. I picked up the copy of the codicil. I folded it precisely into thirds and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I will need to review this, I said. Clarissa's smile tightened. There is nothing to review, she snapped. I stood up from the table. There is always something to review, I replied. I walked out to my car and drove away without looking back. They thought they had secured a quiet surrender. They did not realize they had just handed me a mapped-out crime scene. My first stop the next morning would not be a lawyer. It would be a woman named Martha who kept a private ledger nobody in my family knew existed. The drive from my parents' house to the estate takes 40 minutes along winding 2-lane roads. I did not go back to my apartment in the city. I pointed my car toward the 50 acres of Kentucky soil that my grandmother had bled to hold on to. To understand the gravity of a forged codicil in this state, you have to understand what dirt means to the people who grew up walking on it. In the Bluegrass region, ancestral property is never just real estate. It is a ledger. It records who endured drought, who repaired the oak fencing board by board, and who refused to sell when the developers came knocking with cash offers. Abigail treated those 50 acres like a living relative. The soil here is rich with limestone, the kind that builds strong bones in horses and deep roots in trees. I spent my childhood summers walking those fence lines with her. She carried a bucket of tools and wore leather gloves worn thin at the fingertips. She taught me how to check for rot in the posts and how to read the grade of the land to predict where the water would pool after a storm. I learned early that holding on to a legacy requires constant vigilance. Clarissa never learned that lesson. My sister viewed the farm as a muddy inconvenience. When we were younger, she refused to step off the paved driveway in her pristine shoes. She looked at the rolling pastures and the weathered barn and saw only a holding account waiting to be drained. To Clarissa, history had no value unless it could be liquidated. She wanted the cash the land represented, but she possessed zero interest in the labor required to maintain it. This dynamic was not an accident. It was a carefully cultivated family system engineered by our parents. Thomas and Helen raised Clarissa to believe she was the center of their economic universe. She was the golden child, charismatic and loud, capable of commanding a room with a single practiced laugh. My parents mistook her volume for potential. They treated her endless string of bad decisions as temporary setbacks on the road to inevitable success. When Clarissa decided to open a boutique fitness studio with zero business experience, my parents drained a significant portion of their savings to fund the lease. The studio folded in 8 months. Helen blamed the local market. Thomas blamed the landlord. Neither of them placed the failure on Clarissa, who had rarely shown up to manage her own staff. 2 years later, Clarissa launched a luxury event planning service. Wyatt, her husband, managed the books. They burned through their operating capital in less than a year, leaving a trail of unpaid vendors. My parents took out a second mortgage to cover the deficit and protect Clarissa from litigation. I observed this cycle the way an Operations Research Analyst studies a failing supply chain. I was the quiet variable in the family equation. I moved out at 18, secured my own scholarships, and took night shifts analyzing freight logistics to pay my tuition. My parents viewed my self-sufficiency not as an achievement, but as an excuse to ignore me. Because I did not manufacture crises, I did not warrant their attention. They routed every available resource to the failing node of our family network, funneling their financial and emotional reserves into Clarissa, while I built an independent life out of my own pocket. Abigail saw the system clearly. My grandmother possessed a sharp, unclouded view of her own son and his wife. The summer before she died, she asked me to drive her up to the highest ridge on the property. We parked near a stand of old hickory trees and looked down at the farmhouse. She leaned on her cane and told me she had finalized her trust. She explained her decision with brutal efficiency. She told me that if she left the land to Thomas, he would sell it to cover the next inevitable disaster Clarissa created. She knew my parents would sacrifice 50 acres of our family history to shield my sister from the consequences of her own choices. Abigail refused to let her life work become collateral damage for Wyatt and Clarissa. She bypassed the generational order and named me the sole beneficiary and successor trustee. You know how to fix a broken fence, Abigail had told me on that ridge. You know how to assess a problem and apply the correct measure of force to solve it. This land requires someone who understands weight. Your sister only understands spending. Abigail left the estate to me because she trusted my spine. She knew I would not fold under my parents' demands. She knew I would never pave over the pastures for a quick cash payout. I parked my car at the end of the gravel driveway and turned off the engine. The farmhouse sat dark against the night sky. The silhouette of the barn stood firm against the horizon. The air smelled of damp earth and crushed grass. I sat on the hood of my car and looked at the inheritance my sister was currently trying to steal. Clarissa committing a legal crime was expected. Her greed was a known metric. But her decision to forge a document to steal this specific piece of land elevated the act from simple fraud to a terminal breach of family honor. In Kentucky, trying to swindle your own blood out of their ancestral soil is the ultimate sin. Clarissa was not just breaking the law. She was attempting to erase Abigail's clear intentions before the earth on her grave had even settled. I pictured the codicil sitting in my jacket pocket. The clean, unbroken signature on the page was a glaring error. Clarissa and Wyatt had likely found a template online, printed it on high-quality paper, and spent hours tracing an old signature of Abigail they found on a birthday card or an old tax return. They thought a piece of paper and a compromised notary stamp would be enough to overwrite a legally binding trust. They relied on the assumption that I would react the way my parents wanted me to react. Thomas and Helen expected me to prioritize family harmony over my own legal rights. They believed I would accept the forged codicil to avoid a confrontation, absorbing the loss the same way I had absorbed their neglect for decades. They assumed my quiet nature meant I lacked the capacity for combat. What they failed to understand is that true combat does not require shouting. It requires preparation. Sitting in the dark property, I mentally mapped the variables of the impending conflict. Clarissa needed this land because her financial situation with Wyatt had grown dire. The watch Wyatt wore at the dinner table was new, likely purchased on credit they did not possess. They needed to liquidate the estate fast. To do that, they needed to clear the title. The forged codicil was their opening move, but a fake document is useless if it encounters friction. They needed me to quietly sign a waiver acknowledging the change. That was the sole purpose of the dinner they had orchestrated earlier that evening. The ambush had been planned to corner me in front of my parents, using my mother's soft pleading and my father's silent pressure to force my compliance. I replayed the dinner in my head. The way Helen had placed her hand over Clarissa's wrist. The way Thomas had avoided eye contact while sliding the folder across the table. They had functioned as accomplices in an attempted theft. Whether they knew the document was a forgery or simply chose to look the other way did not matter. Their complicity was a recorded fact in my mental ledger. I knew my next steps with crystalline certainty. I would not argue with them. Arguing provides an opponent with data they can use to adjust their strategy. Silence deprives them of information. I would let them proceed with their plan. I would let them contact real estate agents and dream of their payout. I would allow their hubris to inflate until it reached the point of structural failure. I slid off the hood of my car and retrieved the key Abigail had given me. I walked up the porch steps, the old wood solid and familiar beneath my feet. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the quiet house. It smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The stillness of the rooms offered a profound contrast to the noise my sister constantly generated. I walked into Abigail's study. Her wooden desk sat exactly as she had left it. I opened the bottom drawer and looked inside. This was where my father claimed they had found the updated codicil. The drawer held nothing but blank stationery and a few stray paper clips. The lie was sloppy, constructed by people who did not respect the intelligence of their target. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. The notary office would open in 8 hours. I needed to verify the biometric protocol Abigail had mentioned in passing during her final weeks. I had the raw data from my visual analysis of the forgery, but I needed the ironclad legal countermeasure to ensure Clarissa traps snapped back onto her own hands. The estate outside the window lay sleeping under the Kentucky moon. I stood in the dark study and finalized my operational plan. I would treat my family not as relatives, but as hostile actors in a flawed system. And I was going to dismantle their system piece by piece. I stood in the center of Abigail's quiet study and let the memory of the ambush play out in my mind. Memory is a data set. You review it to find the variables you missed the first time. The forged codicil had not arrived by mail or through a neutral attorney. It had been presented to me during a highly choreographed sequence masked as a routine family dinner. My parents had engineered the environment to maximize pressure and minimize my ability to retreat. Helen had called me 2 days prior. Her voice held that manufactured warmth she reserved for orchestrating unpleasant tasks. She asked me to come to the family home for a meal, framing the evening as a necessary chore. She claimed we needed to sort through Abigail's antique silver and a few boxes of old photographs. I knew my mother hated dealing with grief. She preferred to package uncomfortable realities into neat containers and store them out of sight. I arrived at 6 carrying a bottle of wine I bought with my own money, expecting a tedious evening of packing heirlooms. I walked into the dining room and recognized the operational shift immediately. The table was set, but there were no silver boxes or photo albums in sight. Instead, the center of the polished mahogany table held a single manila envelope. Clarissa sat across from my father. She wore a subdued gray sweater, a stark visual deviation from her usual vibrant wardrobe. It was a costume of mourning worn by a woman who had spent the actual funeral scrolling through her phone in the back pew. Wyatt sat beside her. He shifted his weight continuously, his eyes darting toward the hallway when I walked in. Wyatt possessed the nervous energy of a man participating in a scheme he lacked the intellect to execute properly. This was not a dinner. It was a containment strategy. Thomas cleared his throat. He did not look at me. He looked at the envelope. He pushed it across the wood surface, the friction of the paper making a dry, scraping sound in the quiet room. He offered a tight, rigid smile. He said they had been clearing out Abigail's study and stumbled upon an envelope tucked behind some old tax returns. He called it a late correction, an updated document that fixed a previous oversight regarding the estate. His lie failed basic logic testing. Abigail was fiercely meticulous. She kept her files indexed, labeled, and locked in a fireproof safe. She did not leave critical estate modifications tucked behind outdated tax forms. My father avoided my gaze because he knew the narrative was structurally weak. Thomas avoids conflict by capitulating to whoever generates the most noise. Clarissa generated noise, so he facilitated her theft to purchase his own peace. I reached out and pulled the single sheet of paper from the envelope. As an Operations Research Analyst, I am trained to identify systemic flaws instantly. When a dataset deviates from an established pattern, the error typically reveals itself in the formatting before you even process the numbers. The same principle applies to legal documentation. Abigail True Trust, drafted by a top-tier Lexington firm, utilized precise fiduciary terminology. It established generation skipping provisions, defined contingent beneficiaries, and contained ironclad, irrevocable clauses. The paper in my hands read like a downloaded template. It relied on internet boilerplate language. It used clumsy phrases to revoke prior claims and replace the primary beneficiary. The syntax lacked the rigorous defensive structure an actual attorney builds into a property transfer. I scanned the bottom of the page. The forged signature sat there boasting that fluid, unbroken baseline that defied my grandmother's severe motor decline. Below that sat the notary stamp. David Trent. I recognized the name from a previous conversation Wyatt had proudly dominated months ago. Trent was a former business associate of his, a man who ran a struggling title agency 2 counties over. They had not simply forged a signature. They had colluded with a compromised official to legitimize a felony. Clarissa laced her fingers together and rested them on the table. She lowered her voice to a soft, sympathetic register. Her expression was a masterclass in rehearsed vulnerability. She leaned forward and claimed Abigail had recognized the heavy financial strain Wyatt and she were under. She painted a fictional picture of our grandmother weeping over Clarissa mounting business debts, deciding in her final weeks to keep the estate in the immediate household to support them. The narrative was an insult to Abigail's actual character. My grandmother despised financial irresponsibility. She believed that bailing out reckless behavior only funded future failures. She would have burned the farmhouse to the ground before allowing Wyatt to use her acreage to cover his bad loans. Clarissa was projecting her own desperation onto a dead woman using fake sympathy to mask a brazen cash grab. Helen reached across the corner of the table and patted my knuckles. Her skin felt dry and cool. She delivered her favorite command. "Do not make a scene, Sophronia." She urged me to respect Abigail's final wishes. In her mind, the forgery was a convenient solution. It restored the family hierarchy she preferred. My mother viewed my independence as a threat to her control. By endorsing this fake codicil, she could strip me of my inheritance and save her golden child from financial ruin in one swift motion. The Kentucky culture she adhered to prized the facade of a unified, prosperous family over the ugly reality of accountability. She expected me to absorb the loss silently to protect the family name. They all waited for my reaction. They expected tears. They expected an argument. They had prepared counterpoints to shout over my objections. An argument provides an opponent with friction, and friction creates heat. They wanted a heated dispute so they could label me as ungrateful and unreasonable, validating their decision to cut me out. I denied them the friction. I did not raise my voice. I did not point out the glaring structural errors in the boilerplate text. I did not mention that the notary stamp belonged to Wyatt Associate. I did not inform them that the signature lacked the necessary biological tremors of a dying woman. I starved them of the data they needed to adjust their strategy. I simply folded the document precisely into thirds. I placed it into my jacket pocket. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally at my sister. "Thank you for the meal," I said. I pushed my chair back. It glided silently over the rug. I turned and walked out the front door. The impact of a silent exit on people expecting a fight is profound. It leaves them stranded on a stage with no scene partner. As I walked to my car, I heard no voices behind me. The silence inside that house was heavy-weighted with the sudden, unsettling realization that I had not surrendered. I had simply collected the evidence and left the room. Driving away from my parents' house that night, I felt a deep, clarifying calm. The parameters of the conflict were set. My family had declared themselves hostile actors operating within a fraudulent framework. They had handed me a physical record of their conspiracy. They assumed my quiet departure meant they had won. They failed to realize that an analyst does not argue with a flawed dataset. An analyst dismantles the system that produced it. I stood in Abigail's dark study, running my thumb over the edge of her wooden desk. The memory of the ambush confirmed my operational strategy. The forged document was merely the symptom. The disease was my family entitlement. To cure it, I needed the indisputable countermeasure my grandmother had built into her estate. I checked my watch. The sun would rise in a few hours. Martha's office would open shortly after. My sister had played her opening move using a fake signature and a corrupt notary. I was going to play my next move using 30 years of unshakable loyalty and a secret protocol that would turn their greed into a criminal conviction. The drive from the quiet isolation of the farmhouse back to my apartment in the city felt necessary. I needed to shift from the physical reality of the ancestral land to the digital reality of the data. My apartment does not look like a home built for comfort. It functions as an extension of my office. Dual high-resolution monitors dominate the main room, flanked by processing towers, capable of running complex predictive models. Operations research is the science of decision-making. My daily job requires breaking down intricate logistical networks, identifying systemic flaws, and isolating the exact faulty variables that cause a supply chain to collapse. I do not deal in feelings. I deal in probabilities, constraints, and statistical deviations. I placed the folded codicil on my glass desk and turned on the overhead light. I treated the piece of paper not as a betrayal from my sister, but as a corrupted dataset. The moment you allow raw emotion into an analytical process, you compromise the integrity of your findings. I needed to strip the hurt from my chest and replace it with cold, measurable logic. I was not a heartbroken sister mourning a fractured family dynamic. I was an elite analyst compiling a flawless dossier. I uncreased the document and laid it flat on the glass of my high-definition scanner. The machine hummed, capturing the ink at 1,200 dots per inch. The physical paper transformed into a digital file on my left monitor. I magnified the signature line until the black ink strokes filled the screen. To prove an anomaly, you must first establish a baseline. I spent the next 2 hours opening my personal archives. I pulled 30 verified samples of my grandmother Abigail's handwriting spanning the last 5 years. These were not casual scribbles. I digitized birthday cards, signed checks, and medical intake forms she had filled out while I sat beside her in waiting rooms. I organized these authentic signatures chronologically on my right monitor, tracking the progressive degradation of her motor skills. Abigail suffered from a documented neurological decline in her final years. The tremor in her hands was a biological reality. It manifested in her handwriting through microscopic hesitations, jagged pen lifts, and inconsistent pressure applied to the paper. When Abigail signed her name, the ink told the story of a woman fighting her own nervous system to form each letter. The genuine signatures were ragged, halting, and fiercely determined. I overlaid the forged signature from the Codicil onto the timeline of authentic samples using a transparency tool. The data was irrefutable. The signature on the false document possessed a fluid, unbroken baseline. The curves of the letters swept across the digital grid with a velocity that defied my grandmother's medical condition. The ink distribution remained perfectly even, indicating a steady, unshakable hand. A forger does not write a signature. A forger draws a signature. They focus on replicating the shape of the letters rather than the natural rhythm of the movement. When you draw a name, your brain dictates a slow, deliberate pace. This results in unnatural ink pooling at the start and end of specific strokes. I applied a contrast filter to the scanned image, highlighting the heavy deposits of ink at the apex of the capital letters. The imposter had traced the shape from an older pre-decline sample, entirely ignoring the physical constraints of the woman they were attempting to impersonate. The signature was too perfect. It was a statistical failure. With the biological variable dismantled, I pivoted to the geographical discrepancy. I zoomed in on the notary seal stamped beneath the forged signature. The ink was slightly smudged, but the text remained legible. The commission belonged to a man named David Trent. In the state of Kentucky, notary commissions are tied to specific counties and recorded in public databases. I accessed the state registry and ran a query on Trent. The system returned his profile instantly. He was a commissioned notary, but his registered address placed him in a county 90 miles away from the family estate. Abigail did not drive in her final year. She certainly did not travel 3 counties over to locate a random notary for a crucial estate modification. She utilized Martha, the woman whose office sat 4 blocks from the courthouse in her own town. The appearance of an out-of-town notary was a structural red flag. I opened a new search window and began investigating David Trent. A simple background check revealed he operated a struggling title agency that had faced multiple disciplinary warnings from the state board. I needed to connect the faulty notary to the architect of the fraud. I turned my attention to my brother-in-law. Wyatt functioned as the financial parasite attached to my sister's relentless ambition. He was a serial entrepreneur whose ventures consistently ended in liquidation and unpaid vendors. I pulled the public corporate filings for Wyatt's various defunct limited liability companies. I combed through the articles of organization, the annual reports, and the dissolution notices. It took 45 minutes of data mining to find the intersection. 3 years ago, Wyatt had launched a short-lived real estate holding company. He listed himself as the primary managing member. Listed as the registered agent on the foundational paperwork was David Trent. The puzzle pieces locked together with an audible click in my mind. Clarissa and Wyatt had not just practiced tracing a signature on their kitchen table. They had engaged in premeditated collusion with a compromised state official to legitimize their theft. They paid or coerced a former business associate to risk his commission by stamping a document he knew was fraudulent. The stakes elevated instantly. This was no longer a greedy family dispute over a piece of land. It was a coordinated criminal conspiracy. The adrenaline rush of discovery is a dangerous thing. It tempts you to act prematurely. I sat back in my desk chair and forced my breathing to slow. I visualized the variables. I watched the timeline of their actions map out in my head. Clarissa and Wyatt needed cash fast. They found an old signature, drafted a boilerplate template they found online, and called in a favor from a desperate notary. They presented the fabrication to my parents, relying on Thomas to avoid conflict, and Helen to prioritize her golden child's survival over her dead mother's actual wishes. They orchestrated the dinner ambush, assuming my lifetime of quiet self-reliance equated to an inability to fight back. Their trap was incredibly sloppy. They left digital fingerprints on the notary's stamp and biological errors in the ink. They built a scheme based entirely on their own arrogant assumptions about my intelligence. I opened a new encrypted directory on my workstation. I titled it Estate Reconciliation. I began categorizing the discrepancies into a formal, unassailable file. I created a timeline cross-referencing the dates on the authentic signatures against Abigail's medical records from her neurologist. I documented the ink pooling anomalies with high-resolution screenshots and detailed annotations. I downloaded the corporate filings linking Wyatt to David Trent and saved the state disciplinary records regarding Trent's title agency. I was building a dataset designed to withstand the highest level of legal scrutiny. Every claim possessed a corresponding piece of verified evidence. If they wanted to play a game of legal documentation, I was going to bury them in an avalanche of irrefutable facts. The clock on my screen read 4 in the morning. The city outside my window remained dark, quiet, and still. I had not slept, but I felt zero fatigue. The act of compiling the dossier insulated me from the raw pain of the betrayal. I did not have to think about my mother patting my hand while facilitating a theft. I did not have to think about my father staring at the coffee maker while my sister stole the only tangible connection I had left to my grandmother. The spreadsheet served as my armor. I reviewed the compiled file one last time. The digital analysis was flawless. I had proven the forgery and identified the conspirators. But digital proof is only half the battle in a court of law. A defense attorney could argue that my analysis was biased, or that the corporate connection was a mere coincidence. I needed an analog lock to secure the trap. I needed an independent witness with unshakable credibility to deliver the fatal blow to their narrative. The digital work was finished. The sun would rise soon, illuminating the Kentucky hills. It was time to leave the screen and step back into the physical world. I needed the final variable that Clarissa had entirely overlooked in her rush for cash. I needed Martha. Tuesday arrived with a crisp morning chill that settled over the Kentucky pavement. I parked my vehicle outside a modest brick building in the historic district of our county seat. The brass lettering on the glass door read Martha Vance Notary and Estate Services. Martha was not a relative, despite the shared surname, a common coincidence in this part of the state. She was an institution. She had operated out of this same wood-paneled office for 30 years. Martha possessed the demeanor of a vault. She spoke in measured sentences and kept her desk clear of clutter. Abigail trusted her implicitly. They shared a generational understanding that paperwork was the only reliable armor a woman could wear. I walked inside. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and aged paper. Martha sat behind her heavy mahogany desk reviewing a stack of deeds. She looked up and offered a brief nod of recognition. She did not offer hollow condolences. She understood that grief was a private matter not suited for public consumption. I took a seat in the leather chair opposite her desk and retrieved the folded copy of the fabricated Codicil from my jacket pocket. I slid it across the polished wood surface. I told her my parents had presented this to me during dinner. Martha picked up the page. She retrieved her reading glasses from a silver chain around her neck and placed them on her face. I watched her eyes scan the text. I tracked her reaction. I expected surprise. I received something far more formidable. Martha did not gasp. Her breathing remained even. The only indicator of her internal state was a sharp tightening of her jawline. The muscles bunched near her ears. She read the forged signature and the fraudulent notary stamp. She set the paper down flat on her desk. She removed her glasses. "That is a fabrication," she stated. Her voice held the flat certainty of a judge reading a predetermined sentence. I nodded. I informed her about my digital analysis, highlighting the lack of biological tremors in the ink strokes and the connection between the out-of-town notary and my brother-in-law Wyatt. I told her I possessed the data to prove the fraud, but I required the original trust framework to secure the defense. Martha stood up from her chair. She walked over to a towering steel filing cabinet situated in the corner of her office. This cabinet required 2 separate physical keys to open. She unlocked it and pulled open the heavy drawer. "Your grandmother was a brilliant woman." Martha said, her back turned to me as she searched the files. She knew her son possessed a spine made of chalk. She knew Helen prioritized aesthetics over integrity. And she knew Clarissa viewed the family acreage as an automated teller machine. Martha extracted a thick red expandable folder and carried it back to the desk. She untied the string closure and opened the flap. She did not produce a simple will. She revealed a masterclass in defensive estate planning. Abigail had not merely named me as the successor trustee. She had anticipated the exact tactical maneuver my sister was currently attempting. 2 years prior, Abigail sat in this very office and executed a secret protocol, Martha explained. She recognized the growing desperation in Clarissa and Wyatt. She watched them burn through their event planning business capital. She knew that once she passed away, they would descend upon the estate. Therefore, we established a secondary authentication measure. Martha reached into the folder and pulled out a bound leather journal. It resembled a traditional notary log, but the cover bore a discreet embossed seal. She opened the book and turned the pages until she reached a specific date from 2 years ago. She turned the book toward me. Abigail mandated a biometric seal for any future alterations to her trust, Martha said. I looked at the page. Below a dense paragraph of legal stipulations sat my grandmother, authentic, shaky signature. Next to the signature, pressed firmly into the thick paper, was a distinct thumbprint in dark blue ink. The legal covenant required that any codicil, any amendment, or any transfer of power regarding the 50 acres must bear this exact thumbprint verified in my physical presence. Martha continued. Your sister can trace a signature using a backlight and a steady hand. She cannot forge a biometric marker from a woman who has already been laid to rest. The elegance of the solution settled over me. Operations research teaches that the most secure systems rely on variables that cannot be duplicated. A signature is a visual output. A thumbprint is a physical truth. The document Clarissa had slid across the dining room table was not just fake. It was legally impotent. It lacked the hidden key Abigail had designed specifically to stop her. But Martha was not finished. A secure protocol was the shield. Abigail had also forged a sword. Martha reached back into the red folder and produced a second document. This one was printed on heavy watermarked paper. It was a sworn affidavit drafted, executed, and recorded on video under Martha direct supervision. She handed it to me. I read the opening lines and felt a profound respect for the woman who had raised me. The affidavit was a devastating preemptive strike. In it, Abigail explicitly stated that she was of sound mind and acting without coercion. The text then transitioned into a clinical, undeniable assessment of my sister. Abigail formally documented Clarissa's history of financial instability, detailing the failed fitness studio and the collapsed event planning venture. She noted the second mortgage my parents had taken out to cover those debts. The final paragraph was a masterpiece of legal finality. Abigail declared under penalty of perjury that she would never under any future circumstances alter the trust to benefit Clarissa or Wyatt. She stated that any document claiming otherwise should be immediately treated as fraudulent and submitted to law enforcement for investigation. She built a wall around you, Martha said, watching me read the words. She knew Thomas would try to pressure you into surrendering the land to keep the peace. She wanted to ensure you never had to wonder if you were doing the right thing. She gave you the explicit authority to fight them. I sat in the leather chair holding the heavy paper. The data set was now robust. I had the digital proof of the forgery, the corporate link to the corrupt notary, the secret biometric protocol that invalidated the fake codicil, and a sworn affidavit from the deceased explicitly identifying the perpetrators as hostile actors. I asked Martha to generate certified copies of every document in the red folder. I watched her operate the heavy embossing stamp, pressing the raised seal into the paper. Each crunch of the metal mechanism felt like a lock clicking into place. She placed the certified copies into a fresh manila envelope and handed it across the desk. You hold the leverage now, Martha stated. What is your operational timeline? I took the envelope. Its weight was reassuring. I told her I had no intention of striking yet. A premature confrontation would only allow Clarissa and Wyatt to retract their claim and destroy the evidence. They needed to commit to their lie. They needed to present the forged document to a formal institution. The moment they attempted to use the fake codicil to secure a loan or sell the property, the trap would spring shut. I thanked Martha for her vigilance. She nodded and returned to her stack of deeds, signaling the end of the meeting. I walked out of the wood-paneled office and stepped back onto the Kentucky pavement. The morning chill had burned off, leaving a bright, crisp day. I unlocked my car and placed the certified envelope on the passenger seat. I slid behind the steering wheel and looked at the unassuming brown paper. It was the equivalent of a legal weapon. My family thought they had outsmarted me with a cheap downloaded template and a stolen signature. They had unknowingly walked into a meticulously designed vault. I held the only key. The waiting game had officially begun. I knew my sister's psychology. Her greed was a predictable metric. She would not sit quietly on her supposed victory. She would want to exercise her stolen power immediately. She would want to survey her new domain and begin charting her payout. I just had to step back and let her hubris take the lead. A fraudulent claim requires momentum to survive. Without rapid forward motion, the structural flaws become visible to external observers. Clarissa provided that momentum instantly. 3 days after the dining room ambush, my phone illuminated with a digital notification. My sister had updated her public feeds. I opened the application and observed the inevitable acceleration of her scheme. She stood in the center of the south pasture wearing pristine riding boots that had never touched actual mud. The caption declared new beginnings and proudly announced the future site of a modern luxury subdivision. She tagged several local contractors and a regional zoning official in the post. I did not experience a spike in heart rate. I initiated a screen capture protocol. I archived every photograph, every tagged business, and every comment into the encrypted directory on my workstation. She was generating a public record of her own attempted theft. My parents cultivated this specific brand of hubris. Helen and Thomas viewed physical labor as a character flaw and historical preservation as a financial burden. When Abigail maintained the estate, she did so with a rugged discipline that made my parents deeply uncomfortable. They preferred manicured lawns over working acreage. Erasing the farm to erect identical suburban houses appealed to their sterile sensibilities. My mother proved this alignment when she dialed my number the following Friday. Her tone held the breezy cadence of a woman requesting a minor favor. She asked if I possessed any free time over the weekend. Clarissa needed the old structures emptied. Helen stated, her voice projecting artificial cheer. She requires a clean slate for the development team. The barn is full of your grandmother junk, and we figured you might want a final look before the demolition crews arrive. I replied with an even, measured affirmation. I agreed to handle the barn. Helen praised my cooperative attitude, oblivious to the reality that my compliance was a tactical operation. I arrived early Saturday morning. The dew still clung to the ryegrass, and the air carried the sharp scent of damp earth and aging timber. I bypassed the main house and walked directly to the primary outbuilding. This structure was Abigail's sanctuary. The walls held rows of forged steel tools, meticulously oiled leather harnesses, and ledgers tracking 50 years of property maintenance. This was not junk. It was a museum of endurance. I brought heavy-duty transport crates from my vehicle. I began the extraction. I cataloged every antique wrench, every silver bit, and every handwritten logbook. I wrapped the items in canvas and secured them in the trunk of my car. I systematically stripped the building of its actual worth, leaving only rotted wood and rusted wire for my sister to claim. By mid-morning, the sound of an expensive engine signaled their arrival. Clarissa and Wyatt parked their leased sport utility vehicle near the farmhouse. They emerged wearing coordinated activewear. Clarissa wielded a silver clipboard, treating the object like a scepter of authority. Wyatt carried a surveyor wheel, rolling the measuring device along the pristine grass with sloppy technique. I watched them through the dusty glass of the barn window. They marched across the ancestral soil, pointing at ancient oak trees and gesturing dismissive chopping motions. They were charting utility trenches and asphalt driveways. They were calculating lot lines on acreage that legally belonged to a sealed trust. Clarissa approached the barn doors shortly before noon. She surveyed the half-empty space, her expression pinching with distaste. She tapped her pen against the clipboard and issued a directive. She demanded the remaining debris be hauled away by Thursday. She claimed an excavation contractor was coming to review the grade, and she needed the footprint leveled. I did not challenge her directive. I offered a single acknowledging nod. I asked for the name of the contractor, framing the query as a logistical necessity to coordinate the trash removal. Clarissa eagerly provided the firm title, proud to showcase her managerial role. I committed the name to memory and added the corporate entity to my growing mental dataset. She was binding third-party businesses into her fraudulent scheme, compounding her legal exposure. Wyatt strolled into the structure, kicking a loose plank. He boasted about the zoning variances they planned to file. He detailed the projected profit margins for the initial phase of the subdivision. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man spending phantom capital. Every sentence he uttered functioned as a data point in my investigation. He confirmed their intent to subdivide the legacy, a process that would require formal title clearance and public hearings. They operated under the assumption that the forged codicil granted them unassailable authority. Their arrogance blinded them to the procedural hurdles ahead. They believed my silence equated to a waived claim. The danger of an unchecked ego is the velocity at which it accelerates toward ruin. Clarissa strutted back out into the sunlight, barking orders at Wyatt to measure the distance to the county road. I continued wrapping Abigail hand tools, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The physical land outside was temporarily occupied by hostile actors, but the legal title remained secure in Martha Vault. I watched my sister schedule earth-moving equipment, knowing she lacked the financial liquidity to pay the invoices. She was leveraging future imaginary profits to fund immediate actions. This is a classic symptom of an operational failure. A system running on deficit resources eventually encounters a hard barrier. I intended to be that barrier. I finished packing the final transport crate. I loaded the remaining artifacts into my car, securing my grandmother's tangible legacy within the steel frame of my vehicle. I locked the trunk and walked back toward the main house to wash my hands at the outdoor spigot. Helen and Thomas arrived shortly after, bringing catered sandwiches and iced tea to celebrate the impending development. They set up a folding table on the porch. My father clapped Wyatt on the shoulder, congratulating him on the bold vision. My mother kissed Clarissa's cheek, praising her entrepreneurial drive. The four of them stood on the wooden deck, toasting to the destruction of the property. I stood near the water spigot, drying my hands on a towel. They did not invite me to join the toast. I did not require an invitation. I possessed the biometric ledger and the sworn affidavit. I watched them consume their meal, observing the fragile house of cards they were constructing. Clarissa reviewed her clipboard one last time before departing. She announced that the commercial appraisal was scheduled for early next week. She required a formal valuation to secure the primary development loan from a regional banking institution. She delivered this information loudly, intending to underscore her dominance over the estate. She expected me to react. She expected a display of grief or a desperate plea to halt the appraisal. I denied her the satisfaction. I remained perfectly neutral. I wished her a productive afternoon and drove my vehicle down the gravel path, leaving them to their celebration. As the tires crunched along the dirt, I began preparing for the appraiser arrival. The introduction of a commercial financial institution represented a critical escalation. It transitioned the conflict from a domestic dispute into federal wire fraud territory. Clarissa was escalating the stakes entirely on her own. I just had to be present to document the impact. The crunch of gravel beneath my tires signaled my arrival at the estate on a Tuesday morning. I parked my vehicle near the main house and immediately identified a foreign element in the environment. A sleek silver sedan sat parked adjacent to Wyatt's leased sport utility vehicle. A subtle magnetic decal affixed to the driver's side door displayed the logo of a prominent regional valuation firm. The presence of that vehicle confirmed my operational timeline. The conflict was advancing to the next stage. I retrieved a flattened cardboard box from my trunk and assembled it, maintaining my stated pretext of gathering Abigail's remaining gardening supplies. I walked toward the rear pastures, the scent of wild mint and damp Kentucky soil filling the air. I located the group near the old tobacco barn. The structure stood as a testament to generations of agricultural endurance, its weathered beams holding decades of history. Next to it stood a man in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers wielding a laser measurement device and a digital tablet. This was the commercial real estate appraiser. Clarissa stood beside him, gesturing expansively toward the rolling bluegrass hills. Wyatt hovered a few paces behind them, his hands tucked into his pockets, radiating an unearned smugness. He wore a designer pullover that retailed for more than his defunct event planning business had earned in its final quarter. Clarissa spotted my approach. Her posture hardened instantly. The relaxed, confident posture she had displayed for the appraiser evaporated, replaced by a rigid, defensive stance. She physically repositioned herself, stepping laterally to create a barrier between me and the man with the tablet. She lifted her chin, her eyes narrowing as she assessed my empty cardboard box. "What are you doing here?" Sophronia. Her voice carried a sharp, clipped tone intended to project authority while betraying a profound underlying insecurity. I kept my gait steady and unhurried. "I am collecting the last of the pruning shears and the heirloom trowels." I replied, my voice maintaining a flat, conversational volume. "I wanted to clear them out before your contractors begin their work." Clarissa offered a tight, dismissive smile. She turned back to the appraiser, raising her volume to ensure I heard every syllable. She announced that the current property inspection was merely a routine formality for the lending institution. She boasted about a looming development loan, inflating the projected figures to impress the man recording the data. Wyatt nodded in agreement, shifting his weight from one expensive shoe to the other. He added a comment regarding the favorable interest rates they had secured, projecting the illusion of a seasoned real estate magnate rather than a man running from angry creditors. Wyatt had spent the last 5 years launching and burying LLCs. His most recent failure involved a luxury concierge service that collapsed under the weight of unpaid vendor invoices and tax liens. He operated on the delusion that wealth was a personality trait, rather than a mathematical equation. Securing a loan against this 50-acre estate was his only viable exit strategy from financial ruin. He needed this appraisal to validate the inflated numbers he had pitched to the bank. I watched the appraiser execute his duties. He pointed his laser device at the corners of the tobacco barn, capturing square footage and structural dimensions. He typed rapid inputs into his tablet, translating the sweat, blood, and quiet dignity of my grandmother's life into sterile cash equivalents. He assessed the grade of the soil not for its capacity to nurture deep-rooted trees, but for its suitability to host asphalt driveways and subterranean sewer lines. He equated an unquantifiable legacy to a simple, digestible payout. The urge to intervene forms a natural human response to injustice. A lesser discipline would have prompted me to step forward, interrupt the data collection, and inform the professional that he was evaluating a multi-million-dollar asset for an individual who held zero legal title. The instinct to stop a theft in progress is powerful, but yielding to that instinct would constitute a critical tactical error. If I revealed the forgery at this juncture, the appraiser would halt his work. The bank would cancel the loan application. Clarissa and Wyatt would face embarrassment, but their exposure would remain localized. They would retreat, destroy the fake codicil, and attempt a different angle of attack. I did not want them to retreat. I needed them to commit. In systems analysis, you do not interrupt a failing process if the goal is to capture the exact mechanism of the failure. You allow the variables to interact until the error generates an undeniable output. Clarissa presenting a forged document to her family was a state-level offense. Clarissa utilizing that same forged document to secure a commercial loan from a federally insured banking institution elevated the crime to federal wire fraud. I bypassed the defensive wall my sister had formed. I walked directly toward the appraiser, offering a polite professional nod. "Good morning," I said, extending a hand that held no hostility. I am Sophronia. It is a beautiful day to walk the property. The appraiser accepted the greeting, introducing himself as Mitchell Davis, from a specific valuation group based out of Lexington. He possessed a firm handshake and a tired demeanor, the hallmarks of a man who spent his days assigning numbers to other people's dreams. "It is a prime parcel," Mitchell noted, glancing at his screen. "The topography is highly favorable for residential subdivision." I agreed with a neutral hum, committing his full name, his firm, and his visible digital inputs to my mental ledger. I required this exact information to track the trajectory of the fraudulent transaction. I needed to know the precise lending institution Mitchell's firm contracted with, allowing me to intercept the financial wire at the optimal, devastating moment. Clarissa stepped forward, her patience fracturing. She interjected, stating that Mitchell operated on a tight schedule and needed to finish mapping the northern boundary. She practically shooed me toward the barn, desperate to sever my interaction with the one man holding the key to her financial salvation. I yielded the space without resistance. I wished Mitchell a productive morning and proceeded into the dim, cedar-scented interior of the outbuilding. I began placing rusty shears and wooden-handled trowels into my cardboard box. Through the gaps in the barn siding, I observed my sister. Clarissa watched me retreat into the shadows of the structure. Her shoulders dropped their defensive posture. A victorious smirk touched the corners of her mouth. She interpreted my calm departure as a surrender. She assumed my lack of confrontation equated to submission. In her mind, she had successfully intimidated me into accepting my own displacement. She mistook my analytical observation for defeat. This fundamental miscalculation is the downfall of every arrogant operator. Clarissa believed she was manipulating a passive sibling. She failed to realize she was providing raw data to an analyst building a criminal referral. I finished packing the box and carried it back to my vehicle. Wyatt was leaning against the hood of his SUV, scrolling through his mobile device. He did not bother to look up as I loaded my cargo into the trunk. He felt secure in his stolen authority, convinced the incoming capital would solve every mistake he had ever made. He was mentally spending money derived from a crime that had not yet finalized. I closed my trunk with a firm click. The sound echoed across the gravel driveway. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. As I navigated the winding road away from the estate, I initiated the next phase of the operational model. Mitchell Davis would submit his valuation report by the end of the week. The bank would process the underwriting, utilizing the forged codicil as proof of collateral. The timeline was compressing. The stakes were multiplying exponentially. Clarissa was forging the very chains that would bind her, and I was going to ensure every link held tight. The waiting period required immense discipline, but patience is the primary currency of a successful audit. I drove back toward the city, leaving my sister to reign over a kingdom of glass. She had the appraiser. She had the illusion of control. I had the biometric ledger, the sworn affidavit, and the exact coordinates of the trap she was walking into. I did not return to my apartment after leaving the ancestral estate. The presence of the commercial appraiser dictated a strict shift in my operational timeline. Gathering raw data is only the initial phase of any system audit. The subsequent phase requires building the framework to process that data into a terminal result. I drove directly to the business district in downtown Lexington. I bypassed the firms that handled routine family mediation or simple estate planning. I required a specialized practitioner. I sought a litigator who operated with the same cold precision I applied to supply chain algorithms. I found that exact calculation in a woman named Victoria Croft. Victoria managed a boutique law firm focused exclusively on complex trust fraud and high-tier asset recovery. Her office lacked the plush couches and warm lighting designed to comfort grieving widows. It featured glass walls, strict steel fixtures, and a conference table carved from black granite. She did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a cup of herbal tea. She offered me a leather chair and a legal pad. I sat down and placed my manila folder on the stone surface. I informed her that I possessed evidence of a coordinated effort to defraud a $500,000 trust. I opened the file and distributed the documents across the table. I presented the certified irrevocable trust agreement drafted by my grandmother, actual attorneys. I laid out the sworn affidavit from Martha detailing the secret biometric protocol. I placed the page containing the true thumbprint seal next to the fabricated codicil my family had presented at dinner. I provided the statistical handwriting analysis that proved the signature lacked the biological tremors characteristic of Abigail declining motor function. Finally, I handed her the corporate registry printouts that linked the out-of-town notary directly to Wyatt's history of failed business ventures. Victoria reviewed the materials in profound silence. She read every line of the affidavit. She scrutinized the visual evidence of the ink pooling anomalies on the forged document. She traced the corporate connections between the corrupt notary and my brother-in-law. The air in the room remained still as she absorbed the full scope of the deception. When she finally looked up, her expression mirrored my own internal state. She saw a flawless mathematical trap. "Your sister is not operating in a gray area," Victoria stated, her voice crisp and unyielding. "She has crossed a very dark legal line." Victoria outlined the precise nature of the offenses. Drafting the fake document constituted forgery in the second degree. Presenting that document to my parents and to the real estate appraiser qualified as uttering a forged instrument. However, the introduction of the commercial banking institution escalated the severity of the situation. By submitting the fabricated codicil across state digital lines to secure a development loan, Clarissa and Wyatt were actively engaging in federal wire fraud. To combat a threat of this magnitude, I needed uncompromised legal representation. In my family, financial support always functioned as a leash. My parents, Thomas and Helen, frequently deployed their bank accounts to control Clarissa's behavior. When her luxury event planning business inevitably collapsed, my father covered the outstanding vendor invoices. In exchange, he demanded she attend mandatory Sunday dinners and project the image of a successful entrepreneur to their social circle. They expected me to participate in this illusion. When I refused, they deemed me uncooperative. I knew that if I asked my parents for a single dollar to fund this legal defense, they would leverage the money to force a settlement. They would demand I drop the charges to protect their golden child from prison. I bypassed their influence entirely. I extracted the substantial retainer fee directly from my own private savings. The transaction represented a significant portion of my liquid assets, but it purchased my operational autonomy. Nobody could dictate my terms or urge me to prioritize family harmony over the law. I hired Victoria as an independent entity enforcing a boundary my parents could not breach. We moved to the tactical planning phase. Victoria suggested we file an immediate injunction. We could halt the commercial appraisal, notify the lending institution, and lock the Kentucky property in a protracted probate dispute. The standard legal playbook demanded a swift, visible counterattack. I rejected the standard playbook. I explained the psychological variables driving my sister. If we struck prematurely, Clarissa would activate her defensive protocols. She would claim ignorance and point the finger at Wyatt. She would feign tears and insist the corrupt notary had tricked them. She would destroy the fake codicil and retreat to my parents' living room to play the victim. My mother would eagerly cover her tracks, and my father would beg me to let the matter rest for the sake of the family name. The threat would remain dormant, waiting for another opportunity to steal the land when my vigilance faded. We required a permanent resolution. We needed Clarissa to bind herself to the fraud in a manner she could never unravel. We needed her to place her signature on the final commercial loan documents under penalty of perjury. We had to allow her to lock herself inside the very cage she was building. Victoria understood the geometry of the strategy. We drafted a robust, quiet title action. This document would legally reestablish my true ownership of the Bluegrass property, wiping out any claims generated by the forged codicil. We prepared a formal notice of dispute to invalidate the pending real estate transaction. We also assembled a comprehensive criminal referral dossier destined for the state attorney general. I instructed Victoria to detail the specific mechanics of the pending bank transaction within the file. She explained that commercial lenders rely on title insurance to protect their investments. When Clarissa submitted the forged codicil, the local title agent failed to verify the biometric seal. The title company was preparing to underwrite a multi-million-dollar policy based on a lie. If the bank wired the funds before we intervened, the title company would suffer a catastrophic loss. We were not just protecting my inheritance. We were protecting a major financial institution from falling victim to my sister's greed. The dossier we prepared ensured the state prosecutors would have a pre-packaged case the moment we handed it over. We compiled the weapon, we loaded the ammunition, and we kept our fingers off the trigger. We did not file a single page with the courts. Instead of initiating a loud legal battle, Victoria established a silent perimeter. She contacted a trusted associate operating within the county recorder office. We placed a discreet administrative flag on the parcel number associated with the ancestral estate. If any party attempted to transfer the title record a new deed or attach a commercial lien to the property, Victoria would receive an instant notification. The county clerk would accept the incoming paperwork from the bank, but they would delay the official recording process for 48 hours. That brief window provided the exact margin of time I needed to execute the fatal countermeasure. This operation surpassed the simple protection of 50 acres of land. It represented the enforcement of an unbreakable boundary. For 3 decades, my parents had demanded that I shrink my own existence to accommodate my sister's expanding ego. They expected me to absorb her failures and subsidize her reckless choices with my own peace of mind. Abigail recognized this toxic dynamic and handed me the precise tools to shatter it. I was not just defending the soil. I was defending my right to exist without owing my family my quiet compliance. I left the law firm and returned to my analytical routines. The trap rested hidden beneath the leaves, waiting for the hostile actors to step down. I processed freight logistics during the day and monitored the flagged alerts at night. The waiting period tested my discipline, but I held my position. Days passed with agonizing slowness as the bank processed the fraudulent application. The silence broke on a Thursday evening. The notification did not arrive from the county clerk. It arrived from my mother. Helen dialed my number, her tone possessing a frantic, breathless quality. The lending institution had approved the commercial loan. The closing date was officially scheduled. Clarissa was mere days away from securing the capital and handing the estate over to the regional developer. The conflict was no longer a theoretical exercise. The hostile actors were moving into the final stage of the breach, and the collision was imminent. 2 weeks after my meeting with Victoria Croft, my mobile device illuminated with an incoming call. The caller identification displayed my mother, Helen. I answered the call and immediately registered a shift in her vocal cadence. Her typical measured tone had vanished. In its place was a breathless, frantic energy. She spoke rapidly, her words tumbling over one another in a rush to deliver her news. A regional development firm had presented a cash offer on the ancestral estate. The sum she quoted was staggering. It represented enough capital to instantly erase the suffocating debts Wyatt had accumulated and fund my sister Clarissa through decades of unchecked extravagance. My mother did not present this information as a theft. She framed the impending sale as a hard-fought triumph. Helen always possessed a unique talent for rewriting reality to suit her preferences. She grew up in a modest household adjacent to wealth, always observing from the outside. When she married my father Thomas, she married into the Vance legacy, expecting instant prestige. She quickly discovered that maintaining a 50-acre bluegrass farm required grueling, unglamorous labor. Helen despised the sweat and the dirt. She measured success entirely in liquid currency. To her, this cash offer was not the destruction of a generational heritage. It was the long-awaited realization of her own superficial desires. She continued her rapid monologue praising Clarissa for her brilliant negotiation tactics. Then she delivered the insult she genuinely believed was a concession. Helen suggested that once the funds cleared the escrow account, Clarissa might toss a few $1,000s my way. She framed this theoretical payout as a gesture of goodwill to help me with my rent in the city. The audacity of the proposal would have shattered a lesser discipline. My mother was offering me a fraction of a percentage of my own stolen inheritance and expecting profound gratitude in return. In systems analysis, we refer to this as a corrupted feedback loop. The operator receives false data and adjusts their behavior to reward the system failure. Helen believed she was playing the role of the benevolent matriarch, bridging the gap between her two daughters. She was actually acting as the unwitting courier for a criminal enterprise. I did not raise my voice. I did not point out the profound mathematical insult of her offer. I utilized the operational technique of emotional suppression. I kept my vocal delivery perfectly flat, expressing mild appreciation for the update. By stripping all friction from my response, I encouraged her to keep talking. People who believe they are winning love to share the logistics of their victory. I asked her when they expected the transaction to finalize. Helen, eager to showcase her insider knowledge, provided the exact date. She named a specific Thursday barely 30 days away. She even volunteered the location, naming a well-known commercial title office in the heart of Lexington. She handed me the precise coordinates of their vulnerability, entirely oblivious to the reality that she was helping to arm the trap I had built for her golden child. I ended the call and processed the new parameters. A 30-day closing window for a commercial land acquisition of this scale is dangerously brief. Standard due diligence, environmental assessments, and comprehensive title searches typically require 60 to 90 days. Clarissa was pushing the buyer for a rapid close. She needed to secure the funds before any external auditors scrutinized the paperwork too closely. This acceleration was a direct symptom of Wyatt's collapsing financial shell game. His creditors were circling. The equipment leases from his defunct concierge service were entering default status. The vendors he had defrauded were filing civil suits. Wyatt and Clarissa operated on a razor-thin margin of time. They required a cash injection to outrun the consequences of their own incompetence. Speed was their only remaining defense mechanism. The regional developer, eager to acquire prime Kentucky acreage, matched their reckless velocity. Bluegrass soil is a finite resource. Parcels of this magnitude rarely enter the open market without a protracted bidding war. The buyer recognized a lucrative opportunity to secure the 50 acres well below market value. Corporate greed often overrides institutional caution. The developer instructed their legal team to rush the acquisition process, ignoring standard verification protocols to lock in the favorable price. They prioritized the acquisition over the accuracy of the chain of title. This mutual greed created the perfect environment for a fraudulent transaction to thrive. Clarissa had provided the fabricated codicil directly to the local title agent. Because this agent maintained prior connections with David Trent, the compromised notary, the initial verification flags were bypassed. In standard operational networks, human relationships often introduce the highest risk of catastrophic failure. The title agent trusted the familiar notary stamp and rubber-stamped the preliminary title report. They pushed the file forward toward underwriting without verifying the biometric seal my grandmother Abigail had legally mandated. The pieces were moving exactly as my predictive models had forecasted. Every hostile actor in this scenario was acting according to their most predictable base impulses. My sister was blinded by the promise of unearned wealth. My brother-in-law was driven by the terror of his impending bankruptcy. The developer was motivated by the allure of a cheap acquisition. My mother was intoxicated by the illusion of renewed social status. They were all accelerating toward a brick wall of their own construction. They believed the path ahead was clear and unobstructed. They mistook the lack of visible opposition for a guaranteed success. I sat quietly in my apartment, watching the digital footprint of their transaction inch closer to the deadline. I held the lever that would drop the barrier directly in their path. The days leading up to the scheduled closing required a rigid adherence to silence. Clarissa continued to parade across the ancestral property, acting as the sovereign ruler of a kingdom she did not own. She scheduled earth-moving equipment to arrive the morning after the sale finalized. She ordered custom signage for the subdivision entrance. She spent thousands of dollars on credit banking on the imminent wire transfer to cover her brazen expenditures. Every dollar she spent tightened the snare. I monitored the automated alerts Victoria Croft had established with the county clerk. The system remained quiet, holding its breath. The forged codicil sat in the escrow file, resting like a dormant virus within the financial network. I reviewed the manila folder containing the true irrevocable trust, the sworn affidavit, and the biometric ledger. The physical weight of the paper provided a grounding force. My family had spent my entire life dismissing my analytical nature as a personality defect. They viewed my quiet observation as a lack of ambition. They valued volume over precision. On the approaching Thursday, they would learn the devastating cost of that miscalculation. They were about to discover that the quietest person in the room is often the only one holding the verified data. I packed the certified documents into my leather briefcase. The trap was fully armed. The waiting period was over. It was time to attend a real estate closing. 72 hours before the scheduled transfer of the Bluegrass estate, a new variable entered the equation. Commercial real estate transactions operate on risk mitigation. While the local title agent had bypassed the initial biometric verification, the corporate underwriters sitting in a distant office required a cleaner ledger. They reviewed the chain of title and identified the original trust document naming me as the sole successor. To issue a multi-million-dollar title insurance policy, they demanded a formal quitclaim deed. They needed my signature waiving any future claims against the property to insulate their investment from litigation. Clarissa had hit a procedural wall. She could trace a dead woman's signature because Abigail could not contest the forgery. She could not fake my signature on a quitclaim deed because I was alive, breathing, and capable of auditing the transaction. The banking institution required my verified notarized consent to finalize the loan. My sister needed me to surrender my birthright voluntarily. Clarissa did not possess the courage to ask me herself. She dispatched the family pacifier. Tuesday evening, the intercom in my apartment buzzed. The video monitor displayed my father standing in the vestibule. Thomas wore a rumpled gray suit jacket and carried a thin manila envelope. His shoulders slumped inward, carrying the invisible weight of a household that functioned entirely on manufactured crises. I pressed the button to unlock the lobby doors. I did not tidy my living space. My workstation glowed with dual monitors displaying supply chain algorithms and statistical models. I wanted him to step into my environment and witness the structured reality I had built without his assistance. A knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find the man who had spent 30 years avoiding my gaze. Thomas stepped inside the entryway. He looked 10 years older than he had at the funeral. The skin around his eyes appeared thin and bruised with exhaustion. He clutched the envelope against his chest like a shield. He started speaking before I even offered him a chair. His voice held a practiced, weary cadence. He stated he was in the city running errands and thought he would drop by. The lie was transparent. My father despised urban traffic and avoided navigating the downtown grid unless compelled by an external force. I offered him a glass of water. He declined. He remained standing near the entryway, unwilling to fully commit to entering my sanctuary. He cleared his throat and initiated the rehearsed script. He began by outlining the severe stress my mother was experiencing. He painted a grim portrait of Helen losing sleep, suffering from anxiety, and pacing the hardwood floors of their home. He attributed her deteriorating health to the mounting financial disaster threatening Clarissa and Wyatt. Thomas framed the situation not as a consequence of my sister's poor choices, but as an impending natural disaster threatening to engulf the entire family tree. He explained that the creditors were threatening to seize the event planning assets. He mentioned looming lawsuits and ruined reputations. He utilized every emotional lever he had pulled over the years to force my compliance. Then he extended the envelope. He told me the bank required a simple administrative form to clear the path for the estate sale. He called it a formality. He claimed signing the waiver would release the capital needed to save Clarissa from ruin and restore peace to my mother's daily life. He asked me to be the reliable daughter one more time. I looked at the document protruding from the envelope. It was a standard quitclaim deed. By signing that paper, I would legally sever my ties to the 50 acres of Kentucky soil Abigail had entrusted to my care. I would validate their theft and grant them clean title to sell our ancestral history to a regional developer. I shifted my focus from the paper to my father. Thomas operates on the path of least resistance. He surrenders to the loudest demand in any given room. For decades, Clarissa generated the most noise, so he funneled his energy into appeasing her. He expected me to absorb the deficit. He assumed my quiet demeanor signaled a willingness to carry the burdens others refused to shoulder. I needed to test the limits of his complicity. Up until this moment, I had categorized him as a passive enabler. I needed to know if he possessed active knowledge of the crime. I kept my hands at my sides. I did not reach for the envelope. I lowered my vocal register to a calm conversational level. I asked him a direct binary question. Dad, do you know the codicil is a forgery? The silence in the entryway stretched into a tangible entity. Thomas froze. The air abandoned his lungs in a sudden ragged exhale. His gaze darted from my face to the floorboards, then to the digital glow of my monitors in the adjacent room. He physically stepped backward, shifting his weight toward the closed door. He did not offer a denial. He did not feign outrage or demand to know why I would make such a severe accusation. An innocent man defends his integrity. A guilty man searches for a rationalization. His hands trembled as he gripped the envelope. He kept his eyes fixed on the baseboards. Your grandmother was a very proud woman, he muttered, his voice barely holding its shape. Her true intentions near the end, well, they were complicated. The medical bills were piling up, and she worried about the division of assets. We are just trying to navigate a complex transition. The response provided the exact data point I required. The word complicated serves as a universal shelter for people unwilling to admit they are facilitating a theft. Thomas knew. He perhaps did not execute the forgery himself, but he recognized the signature was fake and chose to endorse it. He weighed the value of truth against the comfort of avoiding my sister rage, and he sacrificed the truth. He prioritized a fraudulent peace over his own mother legacy. His complicity removed the final tether of familial obligation tying me to his comfort. I did not feel disappointment. Disappointment implies an expectation of better behavior. I felt the cool, clean certainty of a verified hypothesis. I stepped closer to him, invading his defensive perimeter. I looked directly into the eyes he refused to lift. I informed him that I would not sign the waiver in a hallway. I stated that a transaction of this magnitude required formal execution. I prefer to review the documents at the official closing table, I told him. I will attend the settlement on Thursday. We can address the paperwork there. Thomas looked up, a flicker of desperate hope crossing his exhausted features. His operational model dictated that a delay equaled an eventual surrender. In his experience, I always needed time to process their demands before ultimately conceding. He interpreted my refusal to sign immediately as mere stubbornness, a temporary roadblock rather than a permanent barricade. He nodded hastily, eager to escape the suffocating pressure of my apartment. He slid the quitclaim deed back into the manila envelope. He thanked me, muttering that he knew I would eventually understand the necessity of the sale. He promised to see me at the title office in Lexington, providing the exact time of the appointment before slipping out the door. The lock clicked into place, securing the boundary between my sanctuary and his retreating footsteps. I stood in the quiet entryway, analyzing the interaction. Thomas believed he had secured a victory. He would drive back to their suburban house and inform Helen and Clarissa that I was being difficult but compliant. He would assure them that the quiet daughter would show up to the title company and sign the required waiver rather than create a public disturbance. He had no idea that his unannounced visit provided the final variable locking the criminal case into an inescapable trajectory. By confirming the closing time and location, he handed me the precise coordinates to deploy the countermeasure. By presenting the quitclaim deed, he proved they were aware of the title defect and were actively attempting to conceal it. I walked back to my workstation. The dual screens illuminated the dark room with lines of code and predictive graphs. The regional developer wanted the land. Clarissa wanted the cash. Helen wanted the social status. Thomas wanted the silence. They all rushed toward the Thursday deadline, blinded by their individual desires. I opened my encrypted directory and added the quitclaim attempt to the formal dossier. I typed out a brief status update and routed it to Victoria Croft, my litigation attorney. I confirmed the time and location for our upcoming deployment. The pieces were aligned upon the board. My family assumed I would shrink to fit the role they had assigned me. They expected the reliable scapegoat to sit at a mahogany conference table and surrender an ancestral inheritance to save a failing sister. They relied on my aversion to conflict to facilitate their felony. An Operations Research Analyst does not fear conflict. We engineer environments where conflict resolves inefficient systems. I prepared my briefcase verifying the presence of the certified trust, the sworn affidavit, the biometric ledger, and the handwriting analysis. The pre-closing maneuvers were complete. The hostile actors were locked into their flight path. The reckoning was scheduled for Thursday morning. Thursday morning arrived with a pale gray sky casting a sharp light over the Lexington business district. The commercial title office occupied the top floor of a modern glass structure overlooking the downtown grid. This specific environment was engineered for significant capital transfers. The conference room featured floor-to-ceiling windows, acoustic paneling, and a heavy mahogany table designed to make the people sitting around it feel powerful and insulated from the consequences of their transactions. The architecture projected legitimacy. It provided the perfect camouflage for a crime. I navigated the downtown traffic with the detached focus of an operator executing a final sequence. I parked my vehicle and met my associates in the lobby. We ascended in the elevator without exchanging unnecessary words. We operated as a unified mechanism built for a singular purpose. I walked through the double glass doors of the suite precisely as the digital clock on the reception wall clicked to 10 o'clock. I am an Operations Research Analyst. Punctuality is not a courtesy. It is a baseline metric of control. Arriving early signals anxiety. Arriving late signals incompetence. Arriving exactly on time signals absolute authority over the timeline. Clarissa and Wyatt had arrived far ahead of schedule. They treated the formal closing room like a personal victory lounge. I observed them through the glass partition before entering the main conference area. Clarissa wore a tailored white designer suit. The garment was deliberately chosen to project flawless triumph and unbothered wealth. She possessed the smug radiance of someone who believed she had successfully outmaneuvered a rigged system to claim her rightful prize. She sat near the center of the table, sipping sparkling water and smiling expansively. Wyatt sat beside her wearing a bespoke navy jacket and a luxury timepiece. He continuously adjusted his cuffs and checked his phone. He exuded the restless energy of a man anticipating a wire transfer that would finally silence his aggressive creditors. He undoubtedly planned to use the stolen capital to fund another doomed business venture. They functioned together as a matched set of unearned confidence projecting an illusion of prosperity, funded by my grandmother's stolen legacy. My parents flanked them, forming a protective human perimeter. Helen had selected a conservative pearl necklace and a muted silk blouse. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood, managing appearances and stretching meager budgets. She carried that desperate need for elite validation into adulthood. Sitting at a high-end corporate table negotiating with regional developers validated her entire existence. She believed she had finally ascended to the social tier she always deserved. Thomas sat quietly beside her studying a complimentary notepad. He looked physically diminished. His posture curled inward. He had spent the last 3 days carrying the knowledge of his own active complicity. He traded his daughter's rightful inheritance to purchase a temporary domestic ceasefire. He traded 50 acres of Kentucky Bluegrass history so he would not have to listen to his wife complain about his other daughter collapsing finances. He avoided looking toward the door. At the far end of the long mahogany table sat the regional development team. 3 men in sharp corporate attire representing the investment firm that intended to pave over Abigail Farm. They projected the impatient predatory energy of executives eager to finalize a highly discounted acquisition. They shuffled their financial disclosures, property surveys, and environmental impact reports. They viewed the pristine soil purely as future profit margins. They did not care about the history of the fences or the endurance of the timber. They only cared about securing the signature that cleared the title for bulldozers. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the conference room. I did not enter the space alone. The dynamics of the room relied on me being an isolated target. I brought a localized disruption. Victoria Croft walked beside me carrying a sleek black briefcase. My litigation attorney possessed the intimidating aura of a predator entering an enclosure. She scanned the room, identifying the legal counsel for the developer and the escrow officer with a cold, clinical sweep. Martha walked on my other side. The 30-year loyal notary wore a practical wool coat and carried her own weathered leather satchel. She radiated a quiet, unshakable authority. She was the living embodiment of Abigail's true intentions. She represented the authentic timeline of the estate. The atmospheric pressure in the room fractured the instant we crossed the threshold. The ambient chatter ceased entirely. Clarissa lifted her gaze to greet me, expecting to see a defeated sibling arriving to surrender. Her manufactured smile stalled. The upward curve of her lips froze in place. Her eyes darted from my face to Victoria, and finally locked onto Martha. The blood drained from Clarissa's cheeks, leaving a pale, sickly undertone beneath her expensive cosmetics. Clarissa recognized the notary. She understood the catastrophic implications of Martha standing in this room. The forged codicil relied on the assumption that the original estate administrators would remain silent or ignorant. Martha's presence destroyed that assumption instantly. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. His posture collapsed. He reached up and loosened his tailored collar, suddenly struggling to process oxygen. Helen recognized the disruption to her carefully curated environment. My mother possesses a visceral allergy to public confrontation and unpredictable variables. She stood up immediately, attempting to flood the room with a wave of artificial warmth. She projected a bright, chirpy vocal tone designed to soothe the developers and manage my behavior. She walked toward me, extending her hands in a theatrical display of maternal affection. She tried to physically intercept my trajectory. She attempted to usher me toward a small secondary chair positioned against the side wall, far away from the active transaction documents and the center of power. She leaned in close and delivered a rapid, sharp whisper near my ear. She told me to sit down quietly and stop overcomplicating a simple transaction. She demanded I sign the quitclaim waiver they had prepared and leave the professionals to finish their important work. She treated me like a disruptive toddler crashing an adult dinner party. She believed she could handle me with a harsh whisper and a firm grip on my elbow. I did not acknowledge her physical touch. I did not respond to her whispered commands. I allowed my prolonged silence to suffocate her artificial warmth. I stepped smoothly around her, maneuvering past her outstretched hands with cold, fluid precision. I treated her intervention as a minor logistical hurdle to be bypassed. I ignored the secondary seating entirely. I walked the full length of the room, commanding the physical space. I bypassed Clarissa, who was now staring at her sparkling water with a look of mounting terror. I bypassed my father, who squeezed his eyes shut as I passed his chair. I arrived at the head of the mahogany table directly opposite the developer legal counsel and adjacent to the neutral mediator. I took the primary seat. Victoria and Martha flanked me, taking the adjacent chairs on either side. The visual geometry of the room shifted instantly. We formed a unified, insurmountable wall of evidence and legal authority. We boxed the hostile actors into the center of the table. I retrieved the thick manila folder from my bag. The file contained the certified trust, the biometric ledger, the sworn affidavit, and the statistical handwriting analysis. I placed it squarely on the polished wood surface. The dull thud of the heavy paper hitting the table echoed through the silent room. The sound finalized the end of their illusion. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single shred of anger, betrayal, or sorrow. Emotion is a vulnerability in a hostile negotiation. I folded my hands over the file and leaned forward slightly. I bypassed my family completely. I did not look at my sister or my parents. I looked directly at the escrow officer sitting at the center of the table, holding her pen over the final settlement statement. The escrow officer sat frozen, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. She represented the institutional gateway. She was the mechanism that would either finalize a felony or halt a disaster. I held her gaze with steady, unblinking focus. The board was fully set. The hostile actors were locked in their seats. The trapdoor was positioned directly beneath their feet. I rested my hands on the unassailable data and prepared to dismantle my sister's flawless lie. I looked directly at the escrow officer sitting at the center of the table, holding her pen over the final settlement statement. "This transaction is fraudulent," I stated. My voice did not echo. It dropped into the center of the room, displacing the sterile corporate air. The escrow officer froze. Her pen halted a fraction of an inch above the signature line. She blinked rapidly, shifting her gaze from the closing documents to my face, and then toward the developer legal counsel. She recognized the precise tone of a legitimate legal challenge. Clarissa erupted instantly. The sudden disruption of her guaranteed payout bypassed her pretense of polished wealth and triggered a primal panic. She stood up so quickly her heavy leather chair scraped backward against the carpet. She slammed her hands onto the mahogany table, causing the water glasses to tremble. She accused me of intense jealousy, shouting that I had spent my entire life resenting her success. She pointed a trembling finger at me, demanding that the title company call security to remove a disgruntled sibling. She threatened to sue me for defamation. She ordered the escrow officer to ignore my disruption and finalize the transfer immediately. I let her shout. I did not interrupt her tirade. I leaned back in my seat and allowed the silence of my legal team to amplify her hysterical noise. Her performance provided a crucial tactical advantage. The regional developers sitting at the opposite end of the table required stability and predictability to deploy their capital. They watched a woman wearing a pristine white designer suit unravel into a frantic, desperate liability. They exchanged uneasy glances. Corporate entities avoid unpredictable variables at all costs. Clarissa was demonstrating a severe lack of professional composure, proving she was entirely too volatile to manage a complex real estate acquisition. Her meltdown authenticated my quiet authority. My mother, Helen, attempted to salvage the situation. She reached up and tugged on Clarissa's sleeve, hissing at her to lower her voice. Helen cast an apologetic, desperate smile toward the developers, trying to frame the outburst as a simple, familial misunderstanding. She prioritized the optics of the situation over the reality of the impending legal disaster. My father, Thomas, sat paralyzed. He stared at his hands resting on his lap, refusing to look at the documents I had placed on the table. He knew the forged nature of the codicil, and he understood that his cowardly failure to intervene had led his golden child into a public execution. Once Clarissa ran out of breath and sank back into her seat, Victoria Croft initiated her sequence. My litigation attorney did not engage in a shouting match. She opened the black briefcase and retrieved the thick manila folder. We did not argue. We simply distributed the data. Victoria extracted a stack of collated packets and slid one copy to the escrow officer and one copy to the developer lead attorney. The distribution of paper functioned as a lethal counterstrike. The first document in the packet was the certified, irrevocable trust agreement. Victoria directed their attention to the second page. She maintained a crisp clinical cadence, explaining that Abigail had executed this binding instrument drafted by a verified Lexington firm, explicitly naming me as the sole successor trustee. The document established that the 50 acres of Kentucky Bluegrass soil legally belonged to a trust framework that Clarissa had zero authority to access or liquidate. The developer attorney adjusted his glasses and began reading the text. His posture stiffened as he recognized the ironclad fiduciary terminology that the forged codicil severely lacked. The true trust contained specific generations skipping provisions and airtight clauses that no amateur template could replicate. Next, we introduced the biometric countermeasure. Victoria directed the recipients to the second exhibit. It was the sworn affidavit detailing the secret authentication protocol Abigail had mandated 2 years prior. Martha stepped forward to provide verbal confirmation. The 30-year loyal notary did not require a microphone to command the room. She stood tall and addressed the table with unyielding clarity. Her presence alone dismantled the fiction my family had constructed. "I managed your grandmother estate documents for 3 decades," Martha stated, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of a seasoned professional. She instructed me to reject any alteration to her trust unless it bore a specific biometric thumbprint seal recorded in my private ledger. "I never authorized the codicil your seller is attempting to execute today. I never witnessed it, and I never applied the required biometric seal." The impact of Martha's testimony struck the table with devastating force. A living, authorized witness had just nullified the foundation of their sale. Clarissa stared at the notary, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. The reality of the hidden vault had finally materialized in front of her. The safety net she assumed she possessed had been severed by an elderly woman she had consistently overlooked. I took control of the third exhibit. I slid the statistical handwriting analysis across the polished wood. I addressed the developer legal team, directly shifting into my role as an Operations Research Analyst. I explained that the signature on their closing documents represented a statistical impossibility. I guided them through the visual data, comparing the fluid, unbroken ink strokes of the forgery against the ragged, halting baseline of 30 verified authentic signatures. I detailed Abigail's documented motor decline, illustrating how the fake signature lacked the mandatory biological tremors of a dying woman. I presented the visual anomalies as hard scientific proof exposing the forgery, not as a family dispute, but as a quantifiable mathematical failure. I watched the escrow officer turn the page, examining the magnified ink, pooling anomalies with widening eyes. The data stripped away any remaining ambiguity. The science of the analysis left no room for emotional debate. Finally, Victoria delivered the terminating blow. She instructed the table to view the final exhibit. It was the background check linking the fraudulent notary stamp to Wyatt. We presented the corporate registry printouts demonstrating that David Trent, the out-of-town notary who stamped the fake codicil, served as the registered agent for a defunct real estate holding company managed by Wyatt. I shifted my gaze to my brother-in-law. Wyatt physically shrank into his chair. His complexion turned a sickly shade of gray. The unearned smugness he had worn like a shield evaporated. He realized we had not just uncovered the forgery. We had unearthed the conspiracy and identified his specific role in orchestrating a federal offense. He had spent his adult life launching failed ventures and relying on my parents to bail him out. He thought this fraudulent real estate transaction would be his ultimate escape hatch. Instead, he found himself tethered to a scheme that carried mandatory prison sentences. He looked at the developer attorney, pleading silently for an intervention that would never arrive. The developer attorney picked up the compiled dossier. He read the documents with a grim, deepening realization. The lucrative land acquisition he had planned to celebrate was dissolving into a toxic liability. In less than 3 minutes, the narrative within the conference room shifted from a triumphant family real estate sale into an active, uncontained crime scene. The executives recognized that transferring funds based on these contested documents would entangle their firm in a sprawling criminal investigation. The lead developer leaned back and dropped his pen onto the table. He murmured to his associate that the title insurance would never underwrite a clouded asset with active fraud allegations. The deal was dead. I watched my parents absorb the collapse of their social and financial safety net. Helen reached for her water glass, her hands shaking so severely she spilled condensation across the polished wood. She had dreamed of boasting about this substantial sale at her country club luncheons. She had imagined the prestige of being the matriarch who facilitated a lucrative regional development. Now she was merely the mother of an exposed criminal sitting in a room full of hostile witnesses. Thomas refused to lift his head. He stared at the carpet, paying the ultimate price for a lifetime of choosing the path of least resistance. He could have stopped this weeks ago by simply refusing to present the fake codicil to me at dinner. He chose cowardice, and his cowardice had led his favorite daughter into a federal trap. The paper trail we laid upon the mahogany table was cold, flawless, and undeniable. It required no raised voices to establish its dominance. Clarissa sat paralyzed, staring at the irrefutable proof of her felony. The designer suit she wore felt like a costume for a play that had just been canceled. She had spent weeks parading across the ancestral soil, measuring lot lines and spending phantom capital. She had banked her entire future on the assumption that her quiet sister would surrender without a fight. She now realized she had walked blindly into a meticulously engineered snare. The silence in the room was deafening, leaving the hostile actors with no remaining avenues of escape. The silence that descended upon the conference room possessed a heavy, suffocating quality. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the sudden vacuum created when a high-velocity object impacts a solid barrier. For several long seconds, nobody inhaled. The regional developer lead attorney broke the stillness. He did not shout. He did not express outrage. Corporate lawyers do not deal in emotion. They deal in risk mitigation. He reached out and closed his leather portfolio with a sharp, definitive snap. He stood up from his expensive ergonomic chair and adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit. He looked directly at the escrow officer, ignoring my family entirely. He stated that his client was withdrawing their cash offer effective immediately. He cited material defects in the chain of title and credible allegations of fraud. He formally advised the title company to halt all settlement proceedings and notify their internal compliance division. He did not offer apologies or bid farewell. He signaled his associates, and the three men walked out of the glass-enclosed room. They took the millions of dollars the future subdivision plans, and Clarissa financial salvation with them out the door. The sound of the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind them finalized the death of the transaction. My mother Helen fractured the resulting silence with a sharp, desperate intake of breath. Her carefully curated facade crumbled, revealing the raw panic of a woman watching her entire social and economic reality disintegrate. She lunged forward across the table, knocking over her sparkling water. The liquid pooled over the polished wood and dripped onto the carpet, but she did not notice. She reached her hands toward me, her fingers grasping at the empty air. She pleaded with me to withdraw the manila folder. She begged me to tell the escrow officer that the documents were a misunderstanding, a silly family dispute that we could resolve privately. Her voice escalated into a hysterical pitch. She abandoned all pretense of dignity. She cried openly, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks. She claimed that if the title company flagged the file, Clarissa would face federal charges. She prioritized her golden child freedom over the desecration of her own mother legacy. Helen revealed her ultimate truth in that frantic moment. She did not care that Abigail had specifically chosen me to preserve the Kentucky soil. She did not care that her favorite daughter had attempted to steal my birthright. She only cared about shielding Clarissa from the ironclad consequences of the law. She pleaded with me to sign a waiver to lie to the authorities, to do whatever was necessary to erase the paper trail I had just laid bare. I sat perfectly still and watched her weep. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not extend my hand to comfort her. I observed her desperation the way an analyst observes a compromised algorithm failing under stress. I informed her in a steady, unhurried tone that the documents on the table were certified public records and sworn affidavits. I explained that one cannot unfile a truth once it has been exposed to a licensed fiduciary. The system was already processing the data, and I possessed zero intent to halt its progression. My father, Thomas, remained anchored to his chair, paralyzed by the catastrophic weight of the lie he had helped enable. He stared at the spilled water dripping off the edge of the table. He finally understood the true cost of his lifelong cowardice. By choosing the path of least resistance by allowing his wife and eldest daughter to trample over my rights, he had steered his family directly into a federal crime scene. He lacked the fortitude to look at me. He lacked the courage to comfort his weeping wife. He sat trapped in a prison constructed entirely of his own passive choices. He realized that his desire for a quiet house had resulted in the loudest, most devastating public humiliation conceivable. Clarissa realized that maternal tears would not save her. The departure of the developers severed her access to the capital she desperately needed to outrun her creditors. The looming threat of a criminal indictment shattered her remaining composure. The instinct for self-preservation overrode her marriage vows. She turned her attention away from me and aimed her terror directly at her husband. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at Wyatt. Her voice cracked as she screamed that the forgery had been his concept. She accused him of sourcing the corrupt notary and drafting the faulty legal template. She claimed she was an innocent victim manipulated by his desperate need to clear his failing business ledgers. She attempted to sacrifice her partner to buy her own innocence right there in the boardroom. Wyatt stared back at her with undisguised venom. The unearned smugness had vanished from his features, replaced by the cornered aggression of a man facing prison time. He did not sit quietly and absorb her accusations. He struck back, detailing her exact role in tracing Abigail's signature. He listed the debts she had accumulated, the credit lines she had drained, and the luxurious lifestyle she demanded he fund. They turned on each other with feral intensity. The unified front they had projected earlier that morning evaporated. They cannibalized their partnership, trading insults and betrayals while the escrow officer watched in stunned silence. This is the inevitable endpoint of relationships built on shared deception. When the external target proves impenetrable, the hostile actors turn their weapons inward. I sat at the head of the table, fully unbothered by the chaos unfolding mere feet away. I did not need to raise my voice to defend myself. I did not need to hurl insults or demand apologies. The structural flaws in their alliance were doing the work for me. They were dismantling their own lives, providing real-time witness testimony to their shared guilt. Victoria Croft. My litigation attorney observed the spectacle with professional detachment. She reached out and gathered the certified copies we had distributed. She tapped the edges against the table, aligning the paper with precise efficiency. Martha, the loyal notary, stood beside us, her posture radiating a quiet, dignified triumph. She had protected her friend's final wishes. She had witnessed the thieves face the impenetrable wall Abigail had built. I reached out and collected my original files. I placed the authentic trust agreement, the biometric ledger, and the handwriting analysis back into my heavy manila folder. I secured the closure tab. The physical act of packing away the evidence signaled the conclusion of my operation. The data had been delivered. The anomalies had been exposed. The system was now resetting to its correct baseline. I stood up from the mahogany table. The legs of my chair glided silently over the premium carpet. My movement drew the attention of my fracturing family. Clarissa stopped screaming at Wyatt. Helen ceased her sobbing. Thomas finally lifted his eyes from the floor. They looked at me, waiting for a final declaration, a parting insult, or a dramatic exit line. I denied them the satisfaction of a theatrical climax. I looked at the escrow officer, who was busily typing notes into her terminal, undoubtedly flagging the file for immediate legal review. I thanked her for her time and her strict adherence to professional protocols. I turned toward the heavy wooden door. I had successfully defended 50 acres of Kentucky Bluegrass soil. I had honored my grandmother's unshakable trust in my spine. I had neutralized a coordinated financial attack and exposed a felony. I accomplished all of this without raising my voice a single decibel. I walked out of the glass-enclosed suite, leaving my parents and my sister trapped in a room with the shattered remnants of their own greed. The true conflict was no longer between them and me. The new conflict was between them and the state authorities, and that was a battle they could not win with tears. The aftermath of a catastrophic failure within a closed system does not happen instantaneously. It unfolds with the slow, crushing inevitability of a collapsing structure. When I walked out of that glass-enclosed suite, I left behind the ignition point. The title company operated under strict state and federal compliance protocols. They are licensed fiduciaries required by law to report material discrepancies and suspected financial crimes. The escrow officer did not possess the luxury of looking the other way to spare my family embarrassment. She immediately flagged the transaction, locked the file, and notified the internal legal department. Within 48 hours, the corporate attorneys for the title agency formally transmitted the fraudulent codicil, the sworn affidavits, and the biometric logs directly to the state attorney general. The matter officially exited the realm of a private family dispute and entered the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. The machinery of the state moves with a cold mechanical precision that no amount of tears can halt. The Attorney General launched a formal probe initiating the investigation at the weakest structural node. They targeted David Trent. The compromised notary lacked the financial resources to mount a robust legal defense. When investigators arrived at his struggling office holding the statistical ink analysis and the corporate registry printouts linking him to Wyatt, he fractured immediately. Trent surrendered his notary ledger and testified against his co-conspirators in exchange for a leniency agreement. He detailed how Wyatt had approached him offering a cash bribe to backdate a stamp on a document Clarissa had already forged. Trent, providing cooperation, handed the authorities the exact sequence of events, transforming a suspected fraud into a documented conspiracy. The cascade failure had officially reached my brother-in-law. Wyatt panicked. His entire operational model relied on avoiding consequences by utilizing my parents as a financial shield. He discovered very quickly that Thomas and Helen could not write a check to dismiss a federal wire fraud investigation. The authorities raided Wyatt's home office, confiscating his electronic devices and financial records. They found the digital footprint of the boilerplate legal template he had downloaded from the internet. They found text messages between him and Clarissa discussing the timeline for the commercial appraisal. The raw data he carelessly left behind constructed a flawless cage around him. He faced multiple indictments related to conspiracy and fraud. His prior creditors, sensing blood in the water, accelerated their civil suits, seizing whatever meager assets remained in his defunct limited liability companies. Wyatt went from projecting the illusion of a luxury real estate magnate to sitting in a deposition chair facing profound prison time in a matter of weeks. Clarissa faced the heaviest blunt force of the legal retaliation. The state indicted my sister on charges of felony forgery and attempted wire fraud. The initial arrogance she displayed at the mahogany conference table evaporated under the harsh fluorescent lighting of a county courtroom. She hired an aggressive defense attorney, hoping to manipulate the system she had always managed to cheat. Her counsel reviewed the certified true trust, the biometric ledger, and the forensic handwriting analysis I had compiled. He informed her that a trial would result in a guaranteed conviction and a mandatory custodial sentence. Clarissa lacked the fortitude to face a jury. She accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to the felony charges to avoid serving time behind bars. The judge handed down a severe suspended sentence, coupled with a crushing restitution order to cover the legal and investigative costs incurred by the title company and the state. The financial penalty represented only a fraction of her true punishment. In the insular culture of Kentucky Bluegrass society, reputation functions as the primary currency. A permanent felony conviction for defrauding a family estate obliterated her social standing. The pristine designer suits and the curated online profiles lost their value the moment her mugshot entered the public domain. The elite circles she desperately courted severed all ties. Country club invitations ceased. Former business associates blocked her contact information. She became a pariah in the exact community she had tried to impress with stolen wealth. Her hubris had promised her a luxury subdivision and early retirement. The reality delivered a criminal record and a lifetime of supervised probation, restricting her travel and destroying her employment prospects. She was confined to a ruined life of her own making. The collateral damage extended directly to my parents. Helen and Thomas had built their entire identity around the illusion of a flawless, prosperous family. They enabled Clarissa because her projected success validated their parenting. When the public record revealed they had conspired to steal an ancestral estate from their own daughter, the resulting humiliation was profound. Their social peers did not confront them directly. Instead, the community deployed the lethal weapon of polite exclusion. dinner party invitations vanished. Their neighbors suddenly found reasons to look away when Helen walked to the mailbox. The silence of their former friends deafened them. My mother could not process the rejection. She externalized her panic, aiming her frantic energy at the only target she felt she could still control. She targeted me. My phone began capturing a relentless stream of voicemails. Helen utilized every manipulative tactic she had honed over 3 decades. The recordings alternated between furious blame and tearful, desperate apologies. In one message, she would scream that I had destroyed the family by turning my sister over to the authorities. She accused me of lacking basic loyalty. In the next message, her tone would soften into a weeping plea, begging me to speak with the judge to release them from the financial ruin they were enduring. She demanded I fix the catastrophe she had helped create. I listened to every single voicemail. I did not delete them. I archived the audio files into my encrypted directory, categorizing them as behavioral data points. I analyzed the recordings, noting the total absence of genuine remorse. She only regretted that the scheme had failed. She mourned the loss of her social status, not the destruction of her relationship with me. I enforced a permanent boundary, utilizing the most effective tool in any negotiation. I utilized unyielding silence. I did not return a single call. I did not draft an email explaining my position. Explanations serve as an invitation for debate, and I possessed zero interest in debating documented facts. I changed my mobile phone number, ensuring they could no longer transmit their panic into my sanctuary. I instructed the security personnel at my apartment building to deny them entry if they ever attempted to visit. I severed the communication lines permanently. Thomas and Helen realized their financial pacifier was no longer available. When Clarissa required exorbitant capital to pay her defense attorneys and her court-ordered restitution, my parents turned to me, assuming I would subsidize their survival. I refused to route a single dollar to their accounts. Without my invisible safety net, they were forced to face the stark reality of their enabler mindset. They had to liquidate their own retirement portfolios, drawing down the funds they had saved for their old age. They sold their assets at a heavy loss simply to keep their golden child out of a state penitentiary. They had chosen to back a thief at the mahogany table. I allowed them to pay the full, devastating price for that choice, knowing the ledger between us was permanently closed. The quiet that settles over a physical structure after a severe defect has been removed is profound. With the hostile variables permanently excised from my daily existence, I took full, uncontested possession of the 50-acre Bluegrass estate. The title cleared the county courts without a single challenge or encumbrance. The formal deed resting in the county clerk office bore my name, establishing a permanent chain of title that no forged codicil could ever threaten again. I did not list the property for sale. I did not entertain lucrative offers from secondary commercial developers hoping to capitalize on the previous failed transaction. I treated the estate the exact same way I treat a compromised logistics network. I applied my operational expertise to restore the property to its original baseline efficiency. The sprawling oak fences required immediate and rigorous intervention. Clarissa had viewed the aging wood as debris waiting to be bulldozed into a landfill to make room for generic subdivisions. I viewed the perimeter as a failing system that demanded structural reinforcement. I hired local carpenters who understood the specific density and grain of Kentucky timber. We rejected cheap synthetic replacements and sourced authentic white oak from regional mills. I mapped out the degradation along the property line, replacing the rotted posts and securing the joints with heavy galvanized hardware. The fence lines transformed from vulnerable borders into a resilient fortress standing rigid against the rolling hills. They marked a boundary that no unauthorized entity would ever cross again. The pastures demanded a similar comprehensive audit. I ordered extensive soil testing to determine the exact nutrient deficits left behind by years of deferred maintenance. I brought in agricultural specialists to reseed the acreage with premium ryegrass and clover, ensuring the root systems would hold the limestone-rich dirt firmly in place during the heavy spring rains. I turned my attention to the old tobacco barn where Wyatt had proudly boasted about his impending excavation plans. I reinforced the load-bearing beams and repaired the weathered siding, sealing the ancient structure against the elements. The barn returned to its intended function, standing as a monument to generational endurance, rather than a target for commercial demolition. The historic farmhouse required the most meticulous calibration of all. I refused to modernize the interior with sterile glass and steel fixtures. I preserved the architectural integrity Abigail had fiercely defended throughout her life. I polished the original hardwood floors until the grain showed clear and bright under the overhead lights. I restored the heavy wooden desk in the study, the exact location where my father claimed the fraudulent paperwork had allegedly been discovered. I filled the empty shelves with leather-bound ledgers and agricultural texts documenting the history of the region. I brought the antique tools I had rescued in my transport crates back to the property, placing them in their rightful locations within the outbuildings. The house ceased being a dormant artifact and became a functional living sanctuary. By late October, the restoration reached a state of perfect operational equilibrium. The oppressive summer heat broke, giving way to a crisp, biting autumn morning. A thin layer of white frost coated the upper pastures, catching the early morning sunlight and reflecting it back into the pale sky. The sharp air smelled of distant wood smoke and turning leaves. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and carried 2 thick ceramic mugs out to the wraparound wooden porch. I sat on a heavy rocking chair, feeling the solid wood beneath me, and waited for my scheduled guest. Martha arrived shortly after sunrise. The loyal notary parked her modest vehicle near the reinforced tobacco barn and walked up the fresh gravel path. She wore a thick-knit wool sweater and carried her familiar weathered leather satchel. I stood up to greet her, handing her a warm mug of coffee. She accepted the drink and took a seat in the adjacent rocking chair. We sat in companionable silence for several minutes, looking out over the rolling green hills. The landscape displayed a pristine, uninterrupted beauty. There were no asphalt driveways carving through the grass, no utility trenches scarring the dirt, and no commercial surveyors mapping out artificial lot lines. The land remained intact, a testament to the ironclad legacy of Kentucky soil, and the grandmother who trusted me enough to build a silent fortress around it. Martha took a slow sip of her coffee and surveyed the restored oak fences stretching toward the horizon. She noted the precise alignment of the wooden posts and the vibrant health of the dormant pastures. You applied a mathematical precision to the dirt, she observed, her voice carrying a quiet, genuine warmth. You fixed the foundation just as your grandmother knew you would. I nodded, acknowledging her accurate assessment. I told her the land simply required an operator willing to read the data and apply the correct maintenance protocols. I treated the soil like a ledger, ensuring every input matched the required output. Martha rested her ceramic mug on her knee and looked toward the distant tree line. Abigail possessed a rare, unforgiving foresight, she said. She knew her son lacked a spine. She knew Helen worshipped social status, and she knew Clarissa worshipped unearned cash. But she also knew that you possessed an unshakable core. Martha turned to look at me, her expression serious and validating. She would be fiercely proud of the quiet, absolute way you dismantled their ambush. You did not just save her farm. You honored her intelligence. Listening to Martha speak, I realized the true nature of the conflict I had successfully navigated. Society often conditions us to believe that power requires a loud voice, a dramatic confrontation, or a theatrical display of dominance. My family operated under that false assumption for decades. They believed that generating noise and chaos equated to wielding true authority. They assumed my quiet disposition indicated an inherent vulnerability they could exploit for their own gain. They fundamentally failed to comprehend that genuine power is entirely silent. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. The most dangerous person is the one taking notes, recording the discrepancies, and building a case while everyone else is distracted by the noise. True power requires clean, verifiable data. It demands flawless documentation and the rigid discipline to withhold your response until the optimal moment presents itself. It requires the patience to let abusers step blindly into their own meticulously constructed traps. I protected my inheritance by removing all raw emotion from the battlefield. I treated familial betrayal not as a devastating heartbreak, but as an anomaly within a logistical system. When an analyst encounters a corrupted variable, they do not cry over the error. They isolate the defect, correct the formula, and move the operation forward without hesitation. I isolated the toxic elements attempting to consume my life, and I excised them with surgical precision. While Clarissa reported to a state probation officer and Wyatt answered hostile interrogatories from bankruptcy attorneys, I spent my mornings walking the fence lines, measuring the growth of the ryegrass, and breathing the clean air of my own sovereign territory. My parents were currently paying the mandatory price for their fraud, navigating a harsh new reality defined by public humiliation and severe financial ruin. They were no longer my concern. Their consequences belonged to the state justice system. My responsibility was the Kentucky soil beneath my feet and the legacy it represented. The estate was safe. My daily peace was permanently secured. The ancestral ledger was finally balanced. That is my story. A demonstration in letting hostile actors build their own prisons while you hold the only key. If you have ever been the quiet one in a loud, entitled family, take this as your confirmation. You do not need to scream to win. You just need to keep the receipts. Drop a comment below if you appreciate a clean mathematical victory, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one. When I look out over the 50 acres of restored bluegrass soil, I do not just see a farm that survived a hostile takeover. I see the physical manifestation of a profound generational failure. The forged codicil. The corrupt notary, the dramatic collapse in that mahogany conference room. Those were merely the final symptoms of a disease that had been incubating for 30 years. The true origin of the betrayal did not begin with a fake signature. It began in the quiet, everyday moments of childhood and the subtle choices my parents made when they decided what kind of love they were going to provide. In modern American culture, we often confuse provision with devotion. We live in a society that heavily prizes external markers of success, where the appearance of a perfect, high-achieving family is frequently valued more than the structural integrity holding that household together. My parents, Helen and Thomas, fell into this trap. They believed that love meant shielding their children from discomfort and projecting an image of unbroken prosperity. But when you shield a child from the consequences of their own actions, you are not protecting them. You are blinding them. This brings us to the first pillar of raising a family, which is the undeniable necessity of fairness and honesty. Many parents operate under the dangerous illusion that rescuing a child from their mistakes is an act of deep affection. But true love is rooted in moral accountability. When my parents consistently poured their resources into Clarissa to cover her failed business ventures, while ignoring my quiet independence, they fractured the sacred equity of our household. Favoritism does not just elevate one child, it corrupts them. By continuously bailing her out, Helen and Thomas inadvertently planted the seeds of extreme greed in my sister. They taught her that rules were flexible, that consequences were meant for other people, and that her desires superseded basic morality. My mother prioritized the aesthetic of a unified, wealthy family over the difficult, ugly work of holding a thief accountable. She wanted to preserve her social standing at the country club more than she wanted to preserve the truth. But teaching a child integrity must begin with a parent who refuses to be an accomplice to a lie. When parents compromise their own ethics to save face, they teach their children that deception is merely a tool for survival. Raising a family also requires a specific, far-reaching wisdom. This is not the wisdom found in textbooks or elite universities. It is the wisdom to see beyond the immediate horizon and understand the long-term law of cause and effect. Clarissa and her husband Wyatt were drowning in debt because they chased the hollow illusion of wealth. They saw Abigail Farm not as a legacy of endurance, but as a giant pile of cash waiting to be liquidated to fund an extravagant, unearned lifestyle. A wise parent teaches their child that true value is not found in the things you can buy, but in the character you build through honest labor. Abigail understood this. She possessed the wisdom to look at her own son and realize his weakness would eventually destroy her life work. There is a profound emotional awareness required to simply step back and let a failing system reset itself. In my career as an analyst, I use data and silence to expose flaws. Parents must also learn the wisdom of stillness. Reacting to every crisis with panic and an open checkbook only guarantees the crisis will repeat. When my father showed up at my apartment begging me to sign away my inheritance to save his wife peace of mind, he demonstrated a profound lack of emotional discipline. He could not tolerate the temporary discomfort of telling his golden child no, so he attempted to sacrifice my future to purchase his own quiet evening. True wisdom requires enduring the storm instead of paying a ransom to delay it. That brings us to the most difficult element of all: courage. It is perhaps the hardest virtue for any parent to practice. When a mother or father sees their child in pain, the biological instinct is to rush in and stop the bleeding. But true growth often requires enduring the fall. Thomas is the embodiment of a father who lacked the courage to establish boundaries. He chose the path of least resistance at every crossroad. True parental love requires the immense fortitude to look a wayward child in the eye and deny them the bailout. It requires the strength to stand by and watch them face bankruptcy, or even the justice system, if that is the exact mechanism required to wake them from their entitlement. You cannot teach a child about boundaries if you do not possess any yourself. When I changed my phone number, blocked my parents' access to my life, and refused to fund their legal defense, I established the iron boundary they had failed to build for 3 decades. I forced them to liquidate their own retirement accounts to keep Clarissa out of a federal penitentiary. In American culture, we are often pressured to forgive and forget to keep the family together despite the cost. But sometimes the most responsible thing you can do for your family is to let the toxic elements face the crushing weight of their own choices. The shield must be lowered so the lesson can be learned. Parenting is ultimately the relentless process of repairing your own character, so you do not pass your fractures down to the next generation. A home should be a training ground for resilience, not an incubator for greed. If you have ever stood on the outside of a golden child dynamic, or if you have had to build your own fortress because the people who were supposed to protect you handed over the keys to the thieves, you understand the weight of this quiet victory. We share these narratives to remind you that peace is worth defending. Follow Fluffy Revenge for more stories about dismantling manipulation and finding your own unshakable ground. Join our community and let us know your thoughts in the comments. As the autumn sun sinks below the Bluegrass hills, casting long shadows across the heavy oak fences, the farm falls quiet. I trace the rim of my coffee mug and think about the generations yet to come. The soil remembers everything. It remembers the sweat of those who built it, and it remembers the greed of those who tried to pave it over. When you look at your own children or the family you are currently building, you have to ask yourself what you are truly cultivating. Are you planting deep roots that will hold fast in a heavy storm? Or are you just laying down fresh green sod over hollow ground? The answers we give our children today become the architecture of their tomorrow. And sometimes, when the house is finally silent, you might catch your own reflection in the dark window glass, wondering if the person staring back was the architect or the storm.